I'm Supervisory Curator and Chair of the Home and Community Life Division at the Smithsonian's National Museum of American History, and I'm honored to be in conversation with this evening's panelists. Let me start in the middle with the woman of the hour, Ilana Trachtman, Director of Eight Novak and producer of the film, and Sarah Leavitt, Curator of the Capitol Jewish Museum. And at the end, my colleague at the Smithsonian's National Museum of American History, Fath Ruffins, Curator. Ilana, let me start with you. You've been involved with the film for quite some time. It's been a journey. Congratulations, and thank you for bringing this story to the screen. What drew you to the story? What made you make this film?
Thank you, and I just want to thank all of you for being here and staying late to listen to this, and the JCC, and this incredible panel. I grew up in Montgomery County. I grew up in Rockville. We used to go to Glen Echo Park all the time. I mean, I performed in adventure theater, and my mother took glass blowing, and my father did wood turning, and we went to the DC Folk Festival all the time. And in high school, I would skip school to hang out there. And it just was like an incredibly evocative place to me. I always, it felt magical. I mean, if you've been there, you see how it has retained the architecture and kind of there's a texture in the air of the place. You can, in the wind, you just are waiting to hear the squeals. And I loved the park, and I always used to pore over those pictures. There's one in particular that's actually not in the film of sailors coming back from World War I, spinning their girlfriends in the air in front of the carousel. And I was back there in 2012, I think. No, sorry, it would have been 2009. And I don't know what serendipity occurred in order for us to meet Park Ranger Sam Swirsky, who ended up telling us about the story of Glen Echo Park's integration. And I was so shocked. It had never occurred to me all those years, looking at all those black and white pictures, that everybody in those pictures was white. It never occurred to me that the park had been whites only for, basically almost all of its history, and that was a really shameful realization. And then as I started to learn more about who integrated the park and the groups that came together, personally I felt a real kinship with Bannockburn. My father was a Jewish labor organizer, and they just sort of felt like people that I could have known, and that was the beginning.
Great. So we're going to be in conversation here for a little bit, and then definitely want to open this conversation up to you. So, but let me start with getting into kind of the sometimes dissonance or between history and memory. We all. Three of us here work in museums, and you as a filmmaker, we're really involved in telling historical stories, but also how people remember and how people memorialize and mythologize some of these stories. So let's first kind of broaden the story a little bit, and maybe start with you, Fath, about looking at where this fits in the broader historical legacy of the Civil Rights Movement and also DC.
Hello, thank you for coming. My name is Fath Ruffins. I work with Chris at American History, and I did grow up in Washington, D.C. I suspect that I'm the oldest person on this panel. I did not grow up going to Glen Echo. My parents, who came to D.C. in the late 50s, in 57, there are pictures in our family of them protesting at Glen Echo. So they didn't live in Bannockburn, and they're not Howard students. They're a young couple in their early 40s, and they have young children. I'm the oldest, and they were protesting. As you probably know from the film, it kind of dwindles, and this is not uncommon at all. after integration, and indeed closes in 1968. So in the years that, say, Ilana might have been going as a teenager and a child, I didn't go to Glen Echo. However, when I came back many years later, and had children, my children spent a lot of time going to Glen Echo and doing activities there. So I have a kind of a complex memory of Glen Echo. As a historian, though, I think a lot about the modern civil rights movement. Of course, the civil rights movement in American history goes back to the beginning of American history. But when we talk about the modern civil rights movement, one of the very interesting things about the Glen Echo experience is that it happens very early in the sit-in, more demonstrably activist part of the civil rights movement, which is, although there were sit-ins before the 1960s, in February of 1960, 4 young men at Greensboro, North Carolina A&T begin to integrate the Woolsworth counter in Greensboro, North Carolina. And that Woolworth sit-in becomes the most famous of the sit-ins. And that's very interesting because the students at Glen Echo are first go into Arlington, actually, and are successfully desegregate some lunch counters there. And that happens so quickly that they are looking around for something else to do, essentially. And they pick Glen Echo. And part of the reason they pick Glen Echo is because it's an amusement park that a lot of people want to go to. This is another aspect. It's less famous, but it's equally as important part of the wider civil rights movement, which is, yes, people were marching and for assembly, for the right to assembly. Yes, people were organizing voter registration. Yes, there are a little bit later freedom rides, but the desire to integrate amusement parks, swimming pools, recreation centers becomes a very important part of the civil rights movement, especially in local areas, because these are the symbols. You know, the Martin Luther King talks about riding around Atlanta with his parents and not understanding why he can't go to the amusement park that he sees over there, white children playing happily at the playground in the amusement park. Why can't he go? And his parents basically say, well, you know, that's restricted. We can't do that. Some parks did have days where black people could go, say like on Monday morning or Sunday afternoon or something like that. Glen Echo did not have that. It was completely white all the time. And because of notions, frankly, that are related to caste and pollution, people would do things like, if there was a day for African Americans to come to swim, for example, then that would be right before they drain the pool for cleaning, so that these issues of the contamination are contained. So there are many elements of the Glen Echo story that reflect and reverberate nationally in terms of what's going on in the modern civil rights movement.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and there's so often those local stories that often revolve around leisure activities and recreation. I grew up in Detroit, and there was an amusement park called Boblo Island that was actually, the Detroit River was in the Canadian waters, actually. But my father, growing up as a kid, was unable to. Was one of few black kids at his high school, and they had an event, near graduation there, and he wasn't able to go to it. So years later, like 30 years later, 40 years later, when I'm growing up, we would, it was certainly segregated, or certainly integrated by that point, but I was told by my father, not only am I never going to, is he never going to that park, but you are never going, so I could never go to that, and so my family held that grudge for a long time. Sarah, in talking about and looking at kind of the history and the memory of the movement, can you talk a little bit about the Jewish-Black relationship, both in this case and in a broader way?
Hi. No. How do I do it? Sorry.
Not only, hi,
I'm Sarah from the Capitol Jewish Museum. Yeah, so one thing that's really interesting when you were talking about memory is really how Jewish people remember Glen Echo, because really in my experience as at the museum, the Jewish memory of the pickets is that a Jewish story. It was Jews, basically, with some black people on the side who solved segregation and fixed Glen Echo. And really, that's the Jewish story. The Jewish story is marching with Martin Luther King. The Jewish story about the Baker brothers, or the Jewish owners of all of these businesses, is really less interesting to people, or just a part of the story that they don't want to tell. And that goes along, one thing that I thought interesting is that you had one of the women in the film saying that Bannockburn was such an oasis for Jewish people because they couldn't live anywhere. And she actually said Jews and Catholics couldn't live. I've done pretty deep dive on restrictive covenants in Montgomery County. I've never seen one that banned Catholics, so that was interesting. I'm not sure if that's true, but I do know that it's about 24% of restrictive covenants in the county ban Jews, and it's a way smaller number and smaller percentage in DC. But that story of Jews, of anti-Semitism in housing and restrictive covenants, that story, that memory, that story we tell ourselves is real big and real powerful. And so I think that's really interesting when we look at the civil rights movement and the Jewish role in it. It's important to me to think about lots of Jewish roles. It's not just the Jewish role or the Jewish story. It's lots of Jewish stories, and the Baker brothers and the Jewish owners, the Jewish developers who kept out black people, those are part of the story too.
Mm-hmm. Ilana, and really for anybody to kind of jump in, so as Faith mentioned, this, the movement was really made up of these many different local activities and actions and so forth that built into something. We may think of it as this, this 10 or 15 year journey that was sort of orchestrated by, one or two groups and a few people that we remember, but it was much more complicated than that. Lots of different groups working for lots of different reasons and in many different, using different strategies and so forth. How did this particularly, and speak a little bit, this is definitely in the film, but a bit about how this affected, one of the things I'm just always struck by is how many really important and powerful people came out of this particular movement. And talk a little bit about that, how it sort of drove some of the rest of some of the later activities.
Thanks. Well, as I was doing this research, I was just kind of continuously amazed by all of these, factoids that were certainly unknown to me and probably unknown to most people. Just like Chris said, 10 of the 1961 Freedom Riders were essentially incubated on that picket line. Just the fact of having the great honor of Roy Wilkins and A. Philip Randolph and Adam Clayton Powell show up on this picket line. Also, it was actually the first time that the American Nazi Party did a public counter-protest. Up until that point, they would have these sort of actions in the shadows almost, and many of us know the story of Skokie, but that's, 10 years later, so this is really early. As far as, there's always the chance that there will be more history uncovered, I certainly hope so, but it's very early in the sense that a white community, a white organization en masse joined with a black student group. There had always been white individuals who had been part of various protests, certainly in NAACP, but this was sort of maybe one of the first times that there was like an organizational joining in that sense. And just, wow, it was Stokely's first protest, who knew? But I just want to come back to what you were saying before about memory, because I think, I've worked on historical films before, but they've usually been around events that are very well known, and they were sort of pocketed in people's memories at the time you know, they kind of like labeled them as like, this is significant, and they were frozen in amber. And because this was never held up that way, people didn't, you know, they weren't writing journal entries of what happened, and there weren't scrapbook pages, a few scrapbooks, but you know, it wasn't like, you know, one's high school graduation or say the March on Washington. And so I was continuously, and I'm sure this is something that all of you grapple with, I was continuously sifting between what people were telling me and what had a chance of being true. And I couldn't put anything in the film that I couldn't verify. And at the same time, I really want to honor the fact that how people remember something is important, even if it's not exactly right. And that's why the memories, the things that are distinct memories, are animated to kind of give you that sense. But I just want to give sort of my favorite example of this. I was interviewing someone who had been part of the group of teenagers, one of the partiers, and all I had told her was that the film was going to be about the protest at Glen Echo and the name of the film. So when I went out to interview, she's just regaling me with story after story of their parties, and you know, more of the parties than anything. And she's telling me about this one time that Stokely jumped over the turnstile, ran to the merry-go-round, is running around the merry-go-round in circles. A policeman is chasing him, and he's looking over his shoulder, and he's saying, well, what do you want me to sit? Because there ain't no back to a merry-go-round. There ain't no back to a merry-go-round. It's like, gosh, I really wish that happened, although I'm sure it didn't. So yeah, I mean, I think it's a really significant part of the work.
Can I just make a comment?
Yeah, go ahead, please.
Which is to say that the memories of individuals, and even group memories, which in some work is called mythos or mythopoetic, because it's more than just an individual, isn't exactly the same thing as what historians do. And it's important to understand that these each have their own validity. It's not, one cannot replace the other in the sense that people's memories are theirs. They're part of their identity. They are reinforced by many social elements, such as what you were speaking about in terms of, it's not just that they're Jewish activists, they're Jewish owners that are enforcing segregation, and that's throughout the country. There are lots of other white people who are owners who are enforcing segregation, and yet there are people who are struggling against it. No community is monolithic. And memory tends to emphasize certain elements over others. Whereas when you're making a historical film or you're writing history, you have to kind of verify these things. Not kind of, it is crucial to verify these things because that's what history does. But it doesn't invalidate a person's memory. It simply adds to our understanding of what's important. It doesn't necessarily replace it. And trying to replace people's memories with history can be
That's tough.
very problematic, okay? It usually doesn't work. That's why I would like to think of it as additive, and also to understand that, you know, humans are meaning-making people, and the people are meaning-making, and so they make meaning in multiple ways. And as a historian for a long time, a curator for a long time, I tend to try and be very respectful of people's memories, because part of what they are telling me is why this is important to them. And that's really the essential part for me. Why is it important to you that we know that Stokely Carmichael was not jumping over or running around, but why is it that you remember it that way? That there's something about remembering that way that is important for us to understand as historians. So I just wanted to add that.
Well, yeah, and it's empowering to people. I think it's like what work does it do to think about Glen Echo as a Jewish story, and what work has that done for these women that you interviewed, especially the women? It was interesting. I thought the Jewish men had kind of a different angle on it, but the women seemed like for them this was such an important part of the story they tell themselves about the work that they did, and that's important. But it's certainly not the whole story.
Be ready with your questions, and just since you guys brought that up, let's make one more question. A number of years ago at the, I was down at the 50th anniversary of the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee conference that began that organization soon in April of 1960, soon after the Greensboro sit-in, and our former Smithsonian colleague, who's recently passed away, Dr. Bernice Johnson-Regan, gave a speech at that conference and was talking about, this is in 2010, how the civil rights movement was, because it has these great stories, because it's such a mythic historical moment that has shaped some of our memories of the past and our understanding and feeling about activism and how we move forward and so forth, that it was becoming contested history, and that also it became a commodity, and that when it turned into those simple stories that were intended to have more of almost a sacred set of meanings, and memories, that the history may suffer. As a filmmaker in working in this space and working on telling the story for a long time, how did you encounter that challenge of telling the sort of story like it was versus how even the legacy and the memory of the movement is becoming politicized and so forth today?
My goal.
My goal with the film was to do both. My goal with the film was to present this history as accurately as was humanly possible, and also demonstrate the way that people felt about it and the impact that it had on their lives and their motivations for being there, their motivations for not being there, but just to really paint as whole, just stalled a picture as possible of being alive in 1960, being present to this moment. And that's why the film doesn't have a narrator, it doesn't have any experts or talking heads. Everybody who's in the film was there. And especially because we have so little access to this, this experience. This story has been forgotten for a long time, and for most of us, it's incredibly difficult to imagine the consciousness of that world. And so I was really trying to transport the audience to that consciousness. I mean, every font in the film is a font from 1960, and the color palette, and obviously all of the footage. So I guess, in a way I was trying to present a primary source, even though obviously it's not, but to give people that experience, because it's falling through our fingers, especially as people are getting older and people are dying, and pretty much most of the main characters in the film could not be interviewed today and be able to tell their story with any coherence.
This gentleman has a question.
I just speak up. Thank you so much for the document. I was a classmate of Debbie Swedenborg's, a Walt Whitman class in 1970, and I recognized it's not. Sorry about that. So some of those photographs with her in the pom-poms were from our yearbook. I recognize that. 2 quick points. I love the kind of old-looking map you showed of the area and the communities. Carver Road, the closest, was originally built, I think, for workers on the David Taylor Model Basin. And that was a segregated sort of semicircle. There's a similar semicircle on the other side of MacArthur, which was for the white workers.
That's right.
So, 2 points. One, was there not in the summer of '65 or '6 a bit of an altercation at Glen Echo that may have contributed to its being shut down? That was the first question. Second question, with regard to Jews and support of African American communities, also on your great map, Scotland. As I recall, Scotland, and even when I was in high school, did not have running water. and a Jewish family woman was very supportive and active in working with that community to make sure that happened. Are those accurate or not?
66 is what you're talking about.
Yeah, April of '66. Well, there's a lot of great information in your question. I don't want to miss anything, but I'll just take on the Glen Echo story. In April of 1966, I think it was Easter. There was a, later historians called, the incident. So I believe, and I haven't read the report lately, but I believe what happened was certain rides had to be shut down. I can't remember why, but certain rides had to be shut down. And there were a lot of kids that were there that day because they didn't have school. And there was an issue that, was it too late for them to take the bus back? Was that what it was?
There's no definitive story, but the reports I read suggest that, first of all, there were a lot of people in the park, more than normally would be in the park. So the park employees and police feel the fear that they are losing control of the crowds. So they shut certain rides down because the lines are getting too long and it's getting towards the end of the day. So they begin shutting down rides, which then makes people upset because they've already bought tickets to get on those rides, or they're standing in line to get on those rides. So there's a lot of confusion, and they decide to close the park, but there are only a small number of buses. And so there are a large number of people who are left behind, there's no transportation for them to get back down closer to the city so they can go to wherever they're going to their homes. Some people call this a riot. Other people call, because you have to remember, by '66, there are riots that have happened in cities in the United States. So some people call it a riot, other people call it an incident or a series of incidents because people start walking back to DC, which, is not a long drive, but is kind of a long walk at night. And many of these people are teenagers. So various things happen. Some people's cars get, the windows busted in, police are called, and it contributes to the dwindling of attendance at Glen Echo. And it really drops off very significantly after this event in '66. And eventually the park is closed in '68. Again, this is not, the specifics of this are details that are important to understand locally, but this kind of problem happens in a lot of amusement areas, parks, swimming pools that are desegregated. And many of them, like for example, many pools throughout the United States are simply filled up. Parks are closed. If they have to be open to everyone, they just close the park. No longer is it a park. They build things over it. So there are a lot of desegregation, which some might argue has not completely happened yet, is a process. It's not like at one moment, suddenly everybody says, okay, it's the new law of the land. That's not what happens. And so as you see this process beginning to happen across the United States very unevenly, you see both rising expectations that are not met, and there is in fact a great deal of white resistance to desegregation. So all of those things, there is tremendous changes that begin to happen in how police forces work. We have our critiques today, but it's different what is being critiqued in the early '60s. And so all of that contributes to this 1966 set of incidents.
I just want to add though, across the country, by the late '60s, small mom and pop amusement parks are closing.
Oh,
Even in parks that had always been integrated.
Yes.
And that's in part due to, the emergence of Six Flags. That's when Disney World opens. Airfare is becoming more affordable to people, so people are spending their leisure time differently. And Glen Echo was certainly not the only park to close, and not the only integrated park to close, and plenty of parks in the north that had always been integrated closed as well.
I also was really hoping that while Faith was talking, I was going to remember the woman that you're talking about. But yes, and there's a fantastic oral history of hers at the Montgomery County Historical Society. It's online. You can read it online. I highly recommend it. It's going to be hard to find since I'm not telling you her name, but Joyce Siegel. Yes, thank you. Yes, and it's a great story. She was getting her degree at University of Maryland and used kind of her own time to really work with the community in Scotland to get the county to pay some more attention. Yes.
Well, unfortunately, we've run out of time, but I want to just ask Ilana, how can we help get more people the opportunity to see this film?
Thank you. Well, the film is is touring the festival circuit kind of around the country. So if you have friends in different places, encourage them, or tell them about the film. And we have a website, which is ain'tnoback.com, where the screenings are listed. Also, I've been so just gobsmacked by the response here, and that every night's been sold out, and when it played at DC Docs, it was sold out. So I'm really hoping that a commercial theater like the Avalon or AFI will take the film and run it for a period of time so that people who didn't get to see it could. So if you know anyone, or if you're stop by the Avalon, or call AFI and let them know that you think it's a good idea. And then the other thing is, I'm really hoping ultimately that the film will have a life in schools. And I'm working on fundraising right now in order to cut down a version of the film that will be classroom length, like 50 minutes or so, and to produce excerpts of the film around particular themes and curriculum guides and discussion guides. And I also have this dream of doing a tour with the film and screening it in the 10 states with the worst records for teaching the civil rights movement.
Well, thank you so much, Ilana, and to my fellow panelists, and also to you for coming out to see the film. Spread that word, and we'll see you next time.